Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's CATHETA webinar, live on September 7th. For those who don't already know, CATHETA means learning in Creek. In that respect, today we'll be learning about tribal grants management from Vince Franco. I do want to draw attention to the fact that this is a part 2. And if you would like to access the part 1 recording, that is available for you in the web links. My name is Brooke Warrington. I am the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're so thrilled you could join us today. Please follow along as I read the disclaimer out loud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. All right, folks, before we get started, I want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. So if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. Here you'll find today's presentation. Please feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you'd like to download and then click the arrow pointing downwards to download and save onto your device. Once the item is downloaded, it should appear in your device's download section. The second box labeled Web Links is where you'll find our survey about today's webinar, along with any other links that will be seen throughout today's presentation. Also note that that is where the part 1 recording is. That's web link number 2. Finally, to the right of the screen, we do have a chat box available. This is how you'll communicate with the instructor and the NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter, or click the up arrow icon button to submit. We do encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. You could also put any tech support issues here. Know that most problems can be solved by simply exiting and re-entering the meeting room. Let's all try out the chat box together now by typing in your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation, please. All right, folks, with that, it's with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Vince Franco. And Vince, I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. As always, hello, my friends. Welcome back. This is part 2 of a 4-part series on grants management under NAHASDA, part 2, understanding NAHASDA. And as Brooke had mentioned, I'm going to try to keep an eye on the chat box as we're going through. I'll do my best to answer questions or concerns or issues or acknowledge, at least verbally, anything that you put in the chat box while we're trying to move along. I'll try to balance that. Thank you for answering Brooke's question and putting information in the chat box already. So I got a couple things before we get started on part 2. I want to go back and do 2 things. One, I want to talk about the feedback that we received for part 1. Thank you, those that were here last week and sat through part 1 and provided some feedback. We really, as Brooke said at the time, we really do look at that information, and I do. I have it here in front of me. I printed it out, and I want to address there were no real questions on the feedback from what I could discern, but there were some excellent points, and I want to bring them to your attention and try to bring some information with them, resolve them as best I can. I really try to do that in real time. So I'm going to do that in 1 minute. And then from there, I want to go to a quick review of part 1, because I know just from looking at the names, I recognize some new names on the roster here. So welcome. If this is your first time joining this 4-part series, I'm going to take a few minutes before we get into the real bread and butter of stuff. I'm going to take a few minutes and go back and talk about what I discussed in session 1 last week. For those of you that were here with me last week, hopefully this will serve as a nice refresher to kind of nail down some of the issues. There were so many things that we talked about last week, and there's going to be a lot that we're talking about today. The big difference in the presentation today, there are nearly as many slides, but good news is there's a lot of information. So you're going to see me when I get into it. I'm going to be hovering over some of the slides, but I'm going to be talking about a lot of things that pertain to the information on the slide. So I think it would be helpful if this is going to be new for you, basically for everyone, to be ready to take some notes. Have pen and paper if you want to go old school, or have that laptop or phone, smartphone ready to take some notes, because I'm going to touch on some things that aren't in the presentation per se. You know, they're not written down, but they're still best practices, updates on some things that happened out there, like with Davis-Bacon, for example. In fact, let me just address that, because that was one of the comments on the review last week. Someone was concerned about being able to check out Davis-Bacon. Good news is we're going to talk a little bit about Davis-Bacon legislation today when I get into the meat of the presentation. There's been some updates, and if you're not familiar with Davis-Bacon, that's okay. You're in the right place. I'm going to talk about that legislation and how it affects those of us that receive federal funds. And one way or another, if we do any construction, we probably have the Davis-Bacon legislation, the act, and prevailing wage issues to deal with. So I'll get to that in a little bit. All right, going back over some of the comments. Welcome from Navajo. Very well. Hi, Debbie. Couple things here. Some comments. Everyone seemed to really enjoy the QR codes. There's going to be a few more coming up. I think the QR codes, from my standpoint as an instructor, are really nice, because they present what they offer. I think for everybody is links to websites and other sources in real time. So it kind of behooves you to, when we come across those QR codes, like we did in session 1, and we're going to do that today, we're going to do it next week, and also in the 4th session when we get into more regulations, to scan those QR codes, download them if best you can, either to your phone, and then forward them as an attachment to an email to your desktop or wherever. Print them out if you can, if they're not unruly, too big, but have them at your disposal, because some of this information you just got to have at your fingertips, literally. As a 12-year compliance person, trust me, every single day I was referring to not only NAHASDA and HUD in our case, because we were the recipients of the Indian Housing Block Grant, so HUD and ONAP, and also the federal regulations, every single day referring to those regs, legislation, etc. So you want that information readily available. So that was one question, or not so much a question, but kind of a liking that the QR codes are there. That's a relatively new feature that is built in, and I really like that embedded into the presentation. Okay. Some of the other comments were more time. I'm doing the best I can, folks. We have, as Brooke said, we have an allotted time slot that we do this, but there's nothing stopping you from reaching out and sending me an email or putting something in the chat box. If we can't answer, if I can't do it, or Brooke or other support staff cannot answer the question, we'll get back to you, just like we're doing with this feedback form. We know you're out there. We appreciate it, and we will try to answer your question. Another one. Try to provide central database grant management options and resource like software was one of the comments. The Seminole Tribe and the Native Learning Center had custom design software for its grants management. So we really didn't get into the private market, but so I don't have firsthand experience working with grants management software, but I can, there's a couple of them out there that I've heard of. And Brooke, if you don't mind, if you would type in for me the first one, Amplifund, AMPLIFUND. Amplifund is a website that you can go to for grants management software. The one thing I did notice in looking over their website is they do address federal funding related to tribes. So that might be an organization. The other one is Gov Grants, GOV capital GRANTS. Gov Grants is another one. Gov Grants. And then the third one is Flux, FLUXX. Again, no, I don't have personal experience working with any of these three, but you can check them out. Maybe someone in the audience knows. If you don't mind putting that information in the chat box, I appreciate it. Grant management software is what the question was. Okay. Other comments were more, feeling comfortable in being able to apply for more grants. Now, keep in mind, what we're talking about today is grants management. This is at the kind of at the back, as the restaurant industry would say, the back of the house. This is after we've received the funding and how to manage that. But there's always should be a great relationship between grant management and grant writing. Grant writing is a whole different animal, and we do have training programs for that. It does have a strong relationship to grants management, but it's a different skill set. So if you're interested in grant writing, that's something that you need to let Brooke know, or Risto, myself, so that other training programs can be designed around that. But there is a strong relationship. Another comment was being more comfortable with reviewing regulations. Good. That's really good. And we're going to get more into regulations as we move on. Davis-Bacon was another one. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit today because there's been some updates with the Davis-Bacon legislation. Internal controls, we talked about that. And I'll talk more about internal controls policies and procedures, not next week, but session 4, because that gets into the uniform guidance, the federal regulations, and that's where internal controls, policies, and procedures, and all the requirements for that, that's where those regulations live. So I'll get into that. So I just wanted to let you guys know that I do look at those reviews, and I appreciate the feedback. It's very, very helpful, and I learned something every time I look at those, because there were 30 or 40 of you in that session last week. There's a healthy 25 today, but that it's good information. So before, and a little bit more, let me move the slide up because I want to, that's me. Here we go. I want to do a quick review of part 1 that we did last week. There were 7 items there. And what I want to do is just take a few minutes and give you the highlights of each of those 7 areas, starting, well, I already did. The resources and grant announcement, the resources were the QR codes. There were a cluster of QR codes that I put in that presentation at the very beginning and then scattered throughout, kind of like we'll be doing today, with all kinds of links to HUD, to the regulations, and so forth. So one of the, or 2 of the links, if you recall, one was the Davis-Bacon, which took you right to the updates for Davis-Bacon legislation, which was a great QR code. And the other one that I highlighted was what's called the GEMS program. Now, those of us that receive Indian Housing Block Grant, IHBG funding under the legislation of NAHASDA, gone through, over the years, have gone through a transition of reporting that has to be done in the form of the Indian Housing Plan and the annual performance report, the IHP and the APR. One's done at the beginning of the year, the other's done at the end of the year. And it used to be that we did those reports in longhand narrative style, and then we moved over to an Excel sheet, and then we moved over to a fillable online PDF, and then eventually we got to a totally 100% online form called Epic, which rolled out about 4 or 5 years ago. I want to say 5 now. But now it's changing. And what I talked about in that award document section, the second arrow there, was the transition that is occurring coming up later this month. If you are a recipient of Indian Housing Block Grant, you know that you have to do the IHP and the APR. That form, that process, that online process is now through what's called the GEMS program. And thank you for the Davis-Bacon. Yep. The GEMS is the Grants Evaluation and Management System. The acronym is GEMS. That's why it's called GEMS. It's issued out of EWONAP Office of Native American Programs, and it's rolling out as of September 25th of this year. So what I recommend, GEMS link, thank you for putting that GEMS link up there. Appreciate that, is go to that link. It was also a QR code that you could go to. You can also go to HUD issued a notice called the nationwide rollout of grants evaluate of GEM, the nationwide rollout of GEM, August 18th. You can go to the notice that was sent out August 18th, which is a several page notice along with attachments of the actual document and information, how to create a profile, etc. So it really is important that if you're receiving Indian Housing Block Grant, you understand that EPIC is being phased out, GEMS is being rolled in, so to speak, and it's becoming nationwide rollout in just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. So it's something you need to be aware of if you're receiving IHBG funds, and that's what I talked about in the very beginning. Then we went in and looked at the second thing there, the award document, took a look at that, and then we moved in, talked about self-monitoring and internal controls. That's the policies and procedures information. Okay. Then we went in, I talked a little bit about managing budgets, and what was important in the budget section was making sure that not only is your budget accurate and transparent, but that all of the costs that you incur and you're using federal funds, Indian Housing Block Grant for, are there are 4 things. They're allocable, which means they can be applied to a cost item. That's the first thing. The second thing is they're allowable. In other words, the federal regulations allow you to spend money, federal funds on that. So that's the difference between allocable and allowable. They are necessary and they are reasonable. So there's 4 things there. Allocable. Yep, I'm looking at chat box. Allocable, allowable, necessary, reasonable. Those are the 4 criteria. Now, here's the catch that I mentioned last week. The federal government does not define for you. Sorry, my screen just went blank because I'm not moving the slide. Get the screen back up. The federal government, in any way, shape, or form, and all the agencies, including OMB, who creates the regulations, does not define what necessary is. It does not define what reasonable is. It does define what allocable is and allowable through the regulations. But those 2 bottom ones there, you see necessary, reasonable, are open for interpretation. That's good and that's bad, as I explained last week. It's good, it's bad. It puts the onus on us to be able to describe, in our particular case, what is a reasonable expenditure? What is a necessary expenditure? You must be able to defend that and put that in your internal controls, your policies and procedures. So, it could, and it's going to change depending upon what the circumstances are. Down here in South Florida, where I'm talking to you from, when hurricanes come through, and they're talking about that stuff right now, there's all kinds of storms percolating in the South Atlantic Ocean, in the Caribbean. Down here, it's flooding, it's wind damage, it's hurricanes. The advantage is they're slow moving, but the damage can be catastrophic. When that happens, our definition of reasonable and necessary is going to change, isn't it? Because there are acts of nature that could cause havoc. But normally, necessary and reasonable is just that. It's a definition that you have to put into your policies. I mention this because the regulations do this all the time. They're intentionally vague. The federal government will not define a lot of things for us. Necessary and reasonable are 2 of the things, but yet they tell us that all of our procurement needs to be necessary, reasonable, allocable, and allowable. It's literally in the regulations. So we're going to revisit that, not next week, but the following week when we do session 4 and we get into those regulations. Okay. We talked about that, tried to bring that to your attention. You've got to be able to justify what that is. Then we got into records and record keeping. All the agencies, to recap that section, all the federal agencies more and more are moving to what's referred to as data-driven reports. That's why EPIC was created, and that's why the GEMS program was created, because everything is flowing more and more towards data-driven reports, data-driven everything. So that forces us to put more and more of our information into electronic format, and data record keeping, data reporting, data gathering of what we do from day to day is becoming more and more critical. OMB, the federal government, is putting pressure on all of the agencies to move towards data-driven processes, and that is trickling down to us. So I talked about record and record keeping, and not just that, but also some of the other things. We're going to get in real deeper into that in 2 weeks when we do session 4, because that's one of the requirements of record keeping is a 3-year period of keeping records according to the federal regulations, 3 years, which personally and from a best practices standpoint, 3 years just doesn't cut it. I don't think, because in my experience, we've had program reviews, we've had audits that go back much farther than 3 years. So you've got to have, and maybe that's where electronic data records are in our favor, because they're easier to store, smaller space, less capacity, and easier, theoretically anyway, easier to resurrect, easier to pull out and provide. So we have to be ready. So when we come to the regulations and record keeping that say 3 years, I really question that. Even the IRS with our personal taxes says 7 years. I mean, maybe they have a better understanding because they just don't have the manpower to go out and do audits, that when they do, they're going to go back further in time, go back. Same thing applies to us. So anyway, we talked about that in the records and record keeping. The other thing I talked about in records and record keeping, relatively new, I mean, it's not a new concept, but it's a new regulation, and that is, as I refer to it, is PII, capital P, capital I, which stands for personally identifiable information. It's going to differ for every organization. With the Native Learning Center, since we do a lot of training, a lot of our PII information, other than the employees, would be instructors. And the instructors, or subject matter experts, as we call them, provide a lot of different information, personal information. You know, their name, so sometimes they're not so much their social security number, but you know, information about who they are, what they do, where they live, and any other voluntary information they give us. Now, that's going to differ for every organization. And if you're receiving Indian Housing Block Grant and using it for low-income Native American housing, you're going to have personal information that you're gathering from your renters and your homeowners, right? Your tribal members, that could be even more extensive, such as their income, their marital status, their education level, their criminal record, if any, things like that, that need to be protected information. Now the federal regulations will get in, we'll really get into that in the Fed regulation part. But I talked about putting in mechanisms in your internal controls and your policies and procedures that limit the access of that information. Well, in hierarchy, identify it at the top level, and then put in mechanisms to protect it, whether it's electronic or hard copy, and then also put into processes who has access to that information and when. So 3 levels there when it comes within record and record keeping regarding personally identifiable information and the protection of that. And I'm not kidding. These are regulations you've got to have in place. And it's becoming more and more sophisticated, right? As we move more and more towards a data-driven environment that we're in. So we got to have conversations with our IT department, our IT people, about mechanisms to protect electronic information constantly and getting more sophisticated as we move. Okay. Then we had wrapped up the section talking about extensions. The only thing I want to point out in extensions and is just adjustments and closeouts, not so much closeouts, but extensions and adjustments, is you need to be aware of what's referred to as prior approvals. The In this case, since the Native Learning Center was an Indian Housing Block Grant recipient, we had to go through ONAP, which is a HUD derivative. It's an office of HUD. And if anything happened that was out of the ordinary, we probably needed to have approval from the HUD office. And there are very specific situations where you need to have written prior approval. For example, when you reduce the amount of your budget by more than 25%, or you change the focus of your program, or third example would be turnover of key staff. Those three and many, many others might put you in a situation where you are forced to approach the agency, the authority, in this case for us, it'd be ONAP, get approval for it, and then put it into motion and then document it, right? That's the compliance part. So I talked about that as part of the extensions and adjustments, prior approval. If you want more information on prior approval and what's included in it, we'll talk about it on session 4, but it's in the uniform guidance. Specifically, it's in 2 CFR part 200.407. Brooke, if you don't mind putting that 200.407 in the uniform guidance. That's where you find the section on prior approvals. There are 25 of them listed there. So you want to get familiar with what would trigger that type of situation. I mentioned 3 of them that would trigger it, but there's all kinds of other scenarios. And then you got to look at it and give it some kind of a degree of difficulty, like they do in diving, a triple dive, triple flip, and half twist is much more difficult to do. So you have than a normal dive. So you have to look at it and determine what the likelihood of this happening, and you got to have a process. So that's what we talked about. I wanted to get those 2 things out of the way before we got into the next real section, which you can see is the bottom left of the screenshot there. And by the way, I'm still looking at the chat box to see if you have any questions or concerns. We are going to move into NAHASDA now. NAHASDA is, as you all smart people probably know, is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. This was approved during the Clinton administration. One of the most or more important things, I think, that administration did during its time. So if you are a recipient of the Indian Housing Block Grant, you need to understand what the legislation is and what it says regarding tribes and regarding the Indian Housing Block Grant specifically. So that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to break it down in the hour that we have remaining. I'm going to go through and give you a lot more information than what you're going to see on the slide. So for example, and while I'm here, let's look ahead a little bit. Next week, we get into, which is also defined in NAHASDA, and that is the regulation specifically from HUD on Native American housing activity guidelines. We'll talk about that next week. Those are regulations that pertain exclusively to low-income Native American housing. So we're going to go through that, get familiar with those regulations, and then the following, or session 4, the last week, more regulations. We're going to look at ONB, which is like the godfather of all the regulations. We're going to look at the uniform guidance, all of those regulations that are contained in what's the street name for it is the super circular. You might have heard of that. That is any organization, any tribe, any tribal organization, any nonprofit, any church, any institution of higher education, any hospital, et cetera, that receives federal funds has to abide by the regulations in the ONB uniform guidance. So we're going to move, after today, we're going to move into the regulations, right? First, we're going to start with housing specific, out of ONEP, and then we're going to get into the ONB uniform guidance, the regs that apply to all federal funding recipients. You're going to learn how to navigate through it. You're going to learn how to interpret, and we're going to look at some of those areas in all of this where the feds do not provide information, sufficient information for us to make a decision. And it puts us in an awkward position where we have to create internal controls and policies and procedures with very little federal guidance. I'll point those out to you and give you my best interpretation. So let's move on because we've got 60 minutes to cover a lot of material. All right, so let's look at, let's see if there's another, okay, go back to that. That's a wonderful pyramid that, kind of a different way of looking at what I just said. At the top of the pyramid is the legislation. And in this case, the main focus is NAHASDA. So I'll get back to that in a minute. And then just below that are going to be the federal regulations. First, as I mentioned, going to be the HUD regulations, 24 CFR Part 1000. That's the one I just mentioned. And followed by 2 CFR Part 200. That's the uniform guidance. Those are the grown-up names for those regulations. All right. Then we're not really going to tear apart all the things below it. What you need to know underneath that, making up the base of the pyramid, holding everything up, are going to be your internal controls, agency guidelines, and below that you've got tribal laws, your own internal controls, policies and procedures, best practices, rules of thumb, all those things that hold the organization together. So one of the things that's not on this screen, but what I want to talk about is at the very top. The NAHASDA, which is the legislation, remember that is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996. It's gone through, since 1996, in the past 27 years that it's been alive, it's gone through 7 different generations of change. So when you ever took the time to look at the actual legislation, I recommend that you do this. You actually go, it's one of our QR codes. You can go to it, you can download it. It's a difficult document to read. I'll give you that much because it's had 7 different revisions to it, and it's all on one document. So it's very difficult to read. It was done in 1998, and the highlights they did in 98, they put in red. Then 2 years later, they did another update that's in blue. Then 2 years after that, and 2 years after that, and 2 years after that, and so on, in different colors. So when you look at the document, if you don't print it out in color, you would never know that it's been changed so many times. What we're going to try to do here in the next 30 minutes anyway, 30, 45 minutes, is to try to make sense out of all this because it's not easy. And if you're like me, I've talked to a lot of tribal people, I've talked to tribal elders. There's a lot of confusion about NAHASDA. Have you ever experienced where you're talking with someone and you're at a meeting and they'll say to you, yeah, we have the NAHASDA grant. And you think to yourself, well, or you should be thinking to yourself, well, NAHASDA is not a grant. You're not going to correct them, unless you feel comfortable with it. But there's a lot of confusion out there. People think that NAHASDA is the Indian Housing Block Grant. No, the deal is NAHASDA is the legislation, sometimes referred to as the act. It's the law. It has created the regulations. That is the 24 CFR Part 1000 you see in front of you. Those are HUD's regulations specifically for low-income tribal housing. And it also creates the possibility of block grants, including the Indian Housing Block Grant, which we will come across. So it's the legislation, all right? But it's changed so many times, it's confusing for even the most scholarly people that deal with this all the time. All right. Trigger happy. Here we go. NAHASDA objectives overview, key points. That's what we're going to try to do here. Okay. And let me follow with my notes because I have a lot of supplemental information here. So bear with me. All right. Understanding NAHASDA. Here are the objectives of HASDA. Pretty straightforward. There are 5 of them, basically, that say a lot. The first one is to assist and promote affordable Native American housing activities, right? That's the first one. Second, to ensure better access to private mortgage markets. Third, to promote self-sufficiency of Native American tribes in general. Fourth, to plan for and integrate infrastructure. And the last one there, to promote and develop private capital markets. Actually, the third one there, to promote self-sufficiency, only captures the second half. I'm going to make a correction here in real time because that third arrow that says to promote self-sufficiency is missing some verbiage. So let me read what it's supposed to say. To coordinate activities to provide housing and to further self-sufficiency and economic and community development. That's where economic development, community development lives. All right. And over to the right is, and I've got my phone right here. I want to do it in real time. Let's all do it together. If you can, let's scan that and see where it takes us. It should take you to NAHASDA. Okay, it took me to HUD. And as I scroll down, we've got NAHASDA final rule. Do you see it there? If you follow me, if you scan the QR code, it takes you to HUD, and then you scroll down. Hopefully, you get to what's called reference materials. And then you should see NAHASDA final rule 24 CFR Part 1000. Below that, NAHASDA Indian Housing Block Grant Regulations, 24 CFR Part 1000. That's probably the original. And then just below that, NAHASDA statute. So you'd want to click on NAHASDA statute, and there it is. At least I'm there. I'm looking at it now, and you see the color. If you're following me at the top, there's a color code. There's a key that shows all the colors, and as you scroll through, this is the most colorful document I've ever seen. If you do not print this in color, you would not know effectively where the changes are. So it's very, I don't know why they do that. It makes it difficult, in my opinion, to read. So you really have to analyze it or go to training like this where we're going to try to break it down. So let's do that. Let's try to break it down. All right. What you see in front of you now are the first 4 of the titles in the NAHASDA. And this is where I'm encouraging you to take some notes, either mental notes or write down, because I'm going to give you a lot more than what you see here on this slide. I'm going to hover on this slide and take each one of these titles and try to break it down and highlight what's contained in each one of them, starting with Title 1, which is the block grant and grant regulations, okay, which is basically the section, as I refer to it, the 100s, right? You can see it's section 101 through section 108. So I refer to it as the 100s. And it's got one listed there specifically, section 102, Indian housing plans. And that is important for us that receive Indian housing block grant funds. This is where you want to take some notes if you can. Within section 102 of Indian housing plans, you find a couple things. You find information on A, plan submissions, B, 1-year plan requirement. In other words, there needs to be a plan for all block grant recipients, including Indian housing block grant. And 2, required information. Everyone that receives block grant funds needs to have the following thing: a description of the planned activities. That's A. B, a statement of need for low-income Native American housing. C, budget, or as they call it here, financial resources. I'm still in section 102, just breaking it down. And D, compliance, including policy, internal controls and policies and procedures. And also in section 2, Indian Housing Plan, part E, talks about TDHEs. Now, that's an acronym. If you've never heard of it, TDHEs are tribally determined housing entities. It can be and is most of the time a separate nonprofit entity under the umbrella of the tribe sometimes it's just a standalone separate nonprofit that serves the tribe, and its mission is to provide housing services for its tribal members. It's referred to as a TDHE, and that is specifically referred to in the NAHASDA section 102 Indian Housing Plans. All right. The other section I want to point out, and it's not on your screen, so you'd want to write this one down, is section 104. 104. Okay. That is called treatment of program income and labor standards. So section 104, treatment of program income and labor standards. This is where NAHASDA references Davis-Bacon, treatment of program income and labor standards. Exactly. This is where NAHASDA specifically talks by name about Davis-Bacon. And you want to get familiar with it because NAHASDA requires it, that it doesn't give the dollar amount threshold. That's another, that we find that somewhere else. But I can tell you what it is. It's $2,000 or more. Using federal funds, you fall into the realm of Davis-Bacon legislation. Now, the question came up on the survey, on the feedback form about Davis-Bacon. Those of you may or may not know that Davis-Bacon went through a rejuvenation. After 40 years, it sat untouched. It has been rejuvenated. But don't let that scare you. Most of the revisions are small. You can, I don't think I have a QR code for it for you right here, but you can go to Department of Labor, and you can go to what's referred to, or you can just Google Davis-Bacon and required acts. Davis-Bacon and required acts. That is where you go to find the updates that occurred to Davis-Bacon. So if you're doing construction on housing or plan to, or rehabilitation of housing units, and you're going to spend more than $2,000 on that, which is a pretty low threshold, you fall into the realm of Davis-Bacon legislation. You got to get familiar with that, and you also will have to use what's referred to as prevailing wages. It's kind of like the union version of construction wages. It's going to be at a higher rate than normal merit shop, open shop construction wages for the trades. It's referred to as prevailing wage. If you ever are interested in looking into prevailing wage, go to the Department of Labor, DOL.gov, Department of Labor, and you can go and you can Google, once you get on the site, prevailing wage, and it'll bring you to the site. At the same time, you could also look into the updates. There's a lot of small changes. I'm going to say none of them are really dramatic that would affect us in our day-to-day activity from what I can tell. They built in some things on anti-retaliation provisions, which is good, protecting the whistleblower, that type of protections. They undid the separation of metro and rural wage rates. I don't know if that affects us. They used to separate metropolitan wage rates from urban wage rates. Now they've mixed them all together. I don't know if that's going to have much of a dramatic effect. It might push up with construction trade wages a little bit, especially in the higher end trades like electricians, and crane operators, and things like that. But I don't see that as a major impact. Other they did some other unconsequential things here and different classifications. They have some revisions in the building on work. They've created new classifications in the areas of solar panel installation, wind turbine, and broadband installation. And the fourth one, electric car chargers. Those are all, they seem old school now, but it takes forever to work its way into federal regulations, and they've broadened the scope of that. So okay, that gives us more to work with some of those, especially with solar. I know solar is and I'm not sure what tribes were doing when it came for solar installation on using Davis-Bacon, prevailing wage. They probably had to go to the Department of Labor and have a determination made specifically for that trade, for that state, for that county, and that's a hassle. So now they've created that determination for us, along with broadband. Thank you. It's actually a gift. It's actually good. So that is in section 104 under Title 1, block grant and grant requirements. Okay. Section number 2, or Title 2, affordable housing activities, the 200s, as I call it under NAHASDA, gets into a couple things. Two that I pulled out, eligible housing activities is probably the most important. It's made up of 9 different areas. And, if you're like me, you're hearing some of this information, and especially when I give you the 9 categories under eligible housing activities, and you're going to say, wow, Vince, that sounds like everything that's built into the IHP and the APR. Well, yeah, because this is the legislation that created the need for the performance reports, aka the Indian Housing Plan, which is named specifically in the NAHASDA as a performance report. Doesn't tell you how to do it. It just says it has to be done on an annual basis. So the 9 categories for Section 102 eligible housing are Indian housing assistance and modernization. Number 2 is the construction and rehab. It's called development. 3 is called housing services, and that's where you'd have counseling and self-sufficiency services. 4 is housing management services. That would be loan processing. Then 5 would be crime prevention and safety. 6 would be model activities. And I have to share with you the fact that the Native Learning Center is a model activity. So it falls under the NAHASDA, but it's a very unique animal, right? Because they don't have any real housing, low-income housing. So they're still eligible for the IHBG, but they're considered a model activities program, which meets one of the definitions of eligible housing. That's number 6. And the numbers that got 7, 8, and 9. 7 is Community Development Demonstration Project. 8 is Self-Determination Act Demonstration projects. And 9 is Reserve Accounts, which we don't really delve into 7, 8, and 9. Usually the top 6. All right, and then below that, it says program requirements, and all program requirements would be for housing, obviously, and that would be your rents. Number 1 would be rents. Number 2 would be maintenance. 3 would be insurance. 4 would be admission eligibility, which is always an issue. Eligibility, admissions, and occupancy are kind of a burning issue, always on the short list of training programs when it comes to housing. And it's addressed here in program requirements that if you're going to receive Indian Housing Block Grant funds for low-income Native American housing, you've got to have admissions and eligibility criteria in place that meet the federal standards. So another area where it behooves you to understand where the legislation is coming from and what they're saying. So you'll find that in Section 2, Affordable Housing Activities, specifically in Section 203, and the items that are listed underneath there. So part of what we're doing here is learning how to navigate the legislation. We're going to do that again next week when we talk about the regulations for housing, right? So I'm doing this because a lot of people, I know this for a fact, being out there, a lot just don't understand what the legislation is. They say, oh, that's just the legislation that creates housing. No, it's much more complicated than that. And I'm hoping that once you go through this, you'll have a better understanding how to navigate and how to interpret some of these, in this case, legislative directives that created ONAP, that created the Indian Housing Block Grant Fund, and most of the requirements that come with it. Right? So that's affordable housing. It is worth the read. It's worth the time and energy to understand. And I just pulled out two. You can see there's section 201 through 210. So there's other things in there, but those are the two most important: eligible Native American housing activities, and then program requirements, especially requirements. Okay, Title 3 is on the allocation of the grant amounts. Now, if you want to get into this, is kind of a self-learning. This is the formula. If you want to understand the dynamics of how, the dollar amount that you receive for the Indian Housing Block Grant, this explains to some degree the allocation process. What is important from a legislative standpoint on the calculating the formula. If you're satisfied with the amount of money that you receive and you're not too concerned about how ONAP goes through determining what your award is, or if you want to do something with it down the road, like apply for federal guarantees that allow you to have up to 5 times your IHBG award, if you don't know how your award is calculated, it's going to be hard to take it to the next level, right? And calculate some of these add-on features that you might be eligible for. So Title 3 talks about the allocation process of the grant amounts in aggregate, how at a high level, how it's calculated and the importance of it. You can see there's only 2 sections. So it's a short read, but it's important. All right, the next one is 4, and that is one of the most important sections of all of NAHASDA, and it trickles through all of the regulations all the way down to us as the recipients of either the Indian Housing Block Grant or all federal funding, not just NAHASDA, not just the Indian Housing Block Grant, but it replicates all of the monitoring of compliance in section, this is the 400s, section 403, monitoring for compliance is extremely important. It gets into a couple different things that I want to bring to your attention. One, it talks about the monitoring of compliance talks about the enforcement of compliance, how important that is, because the worst thing you can do is have policies and procedures and no compliance. In other words, no one's putting on the police officer's hat to make sure that you enforce the policies and procedures you have, right? That's the worst thing that can happen. And it would probably end up in an audit finding that you're not enforcing the policies you have in place, and, or to make it even worse, that your policies are antiquated and old. So that would be a double whammy, double-edged sword. All right, monitoring for compliance also includes periodic monitoring, and I want to bring this to your attention. Periodic monitoring, it's in section 403B, and it's called periodic monitoring. And what it says is that you have to do a self-monitoring, I think they use the word checklist, at least annually, and that checklist has to be submitted with your year-end report. So that would be your annual performance report. So that is required from a legislative standpoint. It trickles down all through all the regulations. You'll see it again next week when we talk about those regulations under ONAP. But my recommendation to you, my best practice recommendation, is to do it more than annually. You don't want to wait to the end of the year. Imagine if you're on an October 1st to September 30th fiscal year, right? So your September 30th fiscal year end is right around the corner. your accounting department is probably screaming at you right now, telling you you got to close out all of your outstanding bills, all your invoices, collect them, get them in before the 30th so we can process the year and close, because it's going to take us 2 months to close out the year. So if you're delayed and you overlap into October 1st, the beginning of another fiscal year, you cause chaos. Then they got to pull things back out, put them in the correct fiscal year, and there's a lot of accounting back and forth. You don't want to do that. So this falls right into that. If you're going to do self-monitoring, you want to do this much more frequently than at the end of your fiscal year. I couldn't imagine starting a self-monitoring right now with a September 30th year end and what if you found something? What if you found a discrepancy in a process that needs to be rectified, that needs to be mitigated? And you would only have 3 weeks to turn that around and then report with your annual report that everything's just fine. That is not reality. So my recommendation is to do your self-monitoring semi-annual or even quarterly. With the Native Learning Center, we did it quarterly. And the first quarter, second quarter, and third quarter were all internal documents, right? They weren't required by mandate. They weren't required, so they were internal. And it helped to identify potential problems, if any, and put in plan a mitigation to resolve the issue. And hopefully it was minor to start with, but you don't give yourself enough time if you don't do that. And you might not be able to resolve the problem. And you don't want to lie on the annual report saying, oh, it's good when it's not, because that's going to come back to haunt you. You know, you lose sleep over it for one thing. And secondly, when the audit team comes in at the end of the year and finds it and knows that you fudged the report, you're in the area of fraud now. So for the love of God, you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're doing self-monitoring efficiently, effectively, and cut yourself a break in your program. Do it more frequently. Now, if you're on the Indian Housing Block Grant Fund recipient, you still got to do this, right? What I would recommend, if you haven't done it already, is go to EWONAP, go to HUD, and go to the HUD website. And then once you get there, go to what's called the self-monitoring checklist, right? Go there. HUD provides it. You can use it for Indian Housing Block Grant, right? The nice thing about it is there are 11 different categories. They have one for general operation. They have another one for compliance. They have another one for procurement. They have one for housing. They have all kinds. There's 11 different categories. What's nice about it is you can kind of mix and match. You can pull different things out of those templates provided by HUD and make your own. That's what we did at the Native Learning Center. We made our own because our operation was unique and not everything fit. We didn't have occupancy issues or rental issues, but we had other issues. We had procurement big time. We had a lot of procurement, so that fit right in. And we had general operation. We had all kinds of things. What I want to make sure, thank you, if that's the site to the HUD checklist, it's worth its weight in gold. Look at it, and let me give you one other tip when you're looking at this checklist. Not only can you pick and choose the questions and make your own checklist, which I very much recommend. And there's the guidebook too. Thank you. But make sure I don't think it's going to be a problem, but doubly make sure that the checklist that you're using contains the most recent version of the federal regulations. So how do you know? When you're looking at the checklist, make sure when it references the uniform guidance, for example, 2 CFR Part 200 whatever, 302, 402s, but you want to make sure that it references 2 CFR Part 200. And the reason I'm saying that is a lot of times the federal guidelines, these reports sometimes lag behind what's happening with regulations coming down from the OMB. So make sure If you have a question, send it to me. I'll look at it for you, and make sure that you have the most recent, up-to-date version, because they'll reference the federal regulations in the checklist, and you want to make sure that it's using the most updated version of the uniform guidance. So make sure it says where it has specific references to CFR dot and whatever the regulation is. Okay. Enough on that. So that's that's monitoring. What you don't have on there is section 404. You can write this in if you wish. Section 404 is performance reports. Very important. Didn't make the cut here, and that was an accident. But section 404 under Title 4 is performance reports. That's where the legislation talks about the IHP by name, Indian Housing Plan, that it has to be done on an annual basis. Thank you. On an annual basis, section 404. And one of the things it references in there, I want to bring this to your attention, is a section on what's called public availability of information. All right, what that means is the legislation says that if you're receiving, the end result of this legislation, which would be block grants, and in particular, Indian IHBG, Indian Housing Block Grant, you know that you have to do an IHB at the beginning of the year, Indian Housing Plan, and at the end of the year, you've got to do the APR, Annual Performance Report, and now we know we've got to put that self-monitoring with it, right? Section 404 talks about public access to that information. What it says is the public should be allowed to look at your reports. Now, but it doesn't say how often, how much, or what reports. It just says the public should have access. So to meet the letter of the law, you need to talk about how you're going to make perhaps your APR available for public viewing without providing too much information. It's your call, but the nice thing about the legislation is it doesn't say how much information you have to provide. So you create the parameters in your internal controls. How often are you going to make it available? For what period of time? So for example, if you're doing the APR after the year end, so September 30th comes and goes, you got to do your APR within, 90 days after the end of the fiscal year. That's going to take you right up to the end of December, pretty close to December 31st, plus or minus a day. You've got to submit it. Then it says on the actual report, if you're familiar with the APR, one of the last questions on there is, will you provide the APR for public viewing? You answer yes to that, but you're going to put stipulations on it. It doesn't ask you how you're going to do it or when or who has access. It just says, are you going to do it? You answer yes, but then you put parameters on it and make it limited access. Maybe the viewing of the APR is available for public review on a very short-term basis by request only to the executive director, and only certain parts are available for public viewing. You don't want to expose your budget items, perhaps, but maybe you want to provide information on statistical or logistical information or demographics, things like that. And so you're creating your own parameters of how you're going to you're meeting the letter of the law, which says you've got to have public availability. It doesn't say public viewing. It says public availability of information. So, okay, we're going to do that, but we're going to limit this because we're not going to give away the farm. We have even though it's federal funds, we have proprietary information contained, and we have a regulation to deal with here too. PII, Protection of Public Information, privately identifiable information. So there's certain things you want to, what's the word they use, redact, you want to cover up. Wrong word. You don't want to, you want to limit what's viewed. You're not redacting anything. You're not discriminating. You are limiting the amount of view time. You're creating parameters so that it's just not wide open. I hope that makes sense. and that you put that. Remember, now this is a policy too, so you're going to have this in your internal controls. You're going to have some kind of policy that says we're going to do this because NAHASDA legislation requires us to do it, and it trickles down through the regulations, and it's also on the APR. But we're limiting that to certain. We have a certain extent of time. So those are the 4. 5 I'm not going to really tear apart because they really don't get into a whole lot of things that affect us on day to day. Title 5 of the legislation gets into termination of assistance. I hope we never get there. If you want to learn how to terminate a program from an audit, a poor audit or some other issue, you can bone up on that in the 500s. The 600s get into Title 6. Federal guarantees. You may want to take a look at federal guarantees. That is something that Indian Housing Block Grant recipients are eligible for with some stipulation. So that would be Title 6. Section 604, to be specific, is training on that, training and information. So you can look at that. But there is a way to get information on federal guarantees. As I kind of alluded to before, a federal guarantee is like a loan that an organization, a tribe, an IHPG recipient can receive at a maximum of 5 times of their annual IHB award. So to get $1 million a year, top loan under the federal guarantee would be $5 million, right? If I did the math correctly. So that's explained in Title 6 if you want to go in that direction. Title 7 is the last one I'm going to talk about. Actually, it's the second to the last. Title 7 gets into other, more on loan guarantees. And in Section 702, it talks about the requirements of what's called useful life. You ever heard that phrase before? This is as the federal government refers to the life expectancy of a home, of a house, of a building. And in the legislation, in Section 702, that section refers to the 50-year leasehold, 50-year leasehold in trust or restricted land for housing. So you may want to mark that one down. You may want to take a look at that. I know useful life of facilities comes into discussion every once in a while. It's kind of like the depreciation on a vehicle. Once you drive a new car off the dealer's lot, it depreciates like 30%, and then over the next few years, it eventually depreciates to 0, right? A lot of businesses will write off the cost of depreciation. That's a generally accepted accounting principle. The same thing applies with housing here. Over time, these houses have a life expectancy. They could depreciate to 0, so you want to see what the legislation says about useful life, 50-year useful life requirements. What's missing here is Title 8. I don't know if we have anyone in the audience from Hawaii, but Section 8 applies to, or Title 8 applies to housing assistance for Native Americans in Hawaii, for Native American Hawaiians. So those are the 8 sections overview of NAHASDA. This slide, finally we move on. I talked about a lot of these. Now we get into key points. And I talked about all of these. Signed into law in 1996 by the Clinton administration, by Bill Clinton himself, provides block grant funding to the tribes, to their tribally designated housing entities, or TDHEs, if they have one. Administered by the Office of Native American Programs, EWONAP. And what you don't have in front of you there are the 6 offices. If you know that, you might know that. You might know what your office is. For everything, just so you know, everything east of the Mississippi, huge swath of land, doesn't have the most tribes, but it's the biggest hunk of, big hunk of property other than Alaska, is what's referred to as the Eastern Woodlands Office of Native American Programs. That's where the Seminole Tribe of Florida was located, being in Florida. So even though that office is in Chicago, Illinois, that was the ONAP office that we reported to. There's also, of course, you've got the national office in DC, but you've got the Alaska up in Anchorage. You've got the Northwest, which referred to the Northwest ONAP in Seattle. You've got the Southwest, that's located 2 offices, one in Phoenix, one in Albuquerque. You've got the Northern Plains, based out of Denver, and you've got the Southern Plains, based out of Oklahoma City. So there's the corporate, and then headquarters, whatever you call it, and then there's 6 ONAP offices scattered across the country. I can say that at one point, we usually dealt with Eastern Woodlands, but there were times when we dealt with all the ONAP offices back in the day when we had a cooperative agreement for training, and we were getting input from all 6 ONAP offices. And I have to say that, the ONAP offices and the people that are there, they're all cut from the same cloth, so to speak. They all march to the same order and do the same thing, but every office is different. Every office is different. And I have to say, and I'm not being facetious or downplaying any of the other ONAP offices, but we had a great still do, have a great working relationship with Eastern Woodlands out of Chicago, and in our contacts there, they've been, in my experience, were extremely, extremely helpful in making sure that we were able to move forward with our IHBG program. Okay. I talked about the plan. I talked about TDAGs. Okay. Key points. I talked about how it defines NAHASDA, the legislation defines a tribally determined housing entity. It's actually referred to specifically in there in Section 4. Very early in the legislation, right up from Section 4, before you even get into the 100, Section 4 defines where you find the definitions. It talks about a tribally determined housing entity. So if you're ever wondering where that came from, that's where it was. It was created by legislation. Okay, so that goes way back. And I talked about the loan guarantee program, and the second bullet, tribes can use the secretary. What they refer to here is the secretary's approval. So let me put a clear definition on that phrase, secretary's approval, for federal guarantee and other things. What the secretary's approval really is the term I used before, prior approval. And you see it in the checkbox. We had it in there somewhere up towards the top. 200.407 is the prior approval, where you need to have written approval from the ONAP office, in this case, if you're an IHBG recipient, for a variety of different categories. Secretary's approval is it's like the Queen's English here of saying a written prior approval to do certain things. So that's where it lives. If you're interested in the federal loan guarantee program, that is Title VI. If you want to look into it a little more, and if you wouldn't mind putting this in the chat box, Brooke, is the loan guarantee is part of Title VI, Roman numerals, Title VI. And the CFDA, capital CFDA number is 14.869. 14.869 is the CFDA. And you're eligible if you, 14. You got it. There you go. Thank you. IHBG recipients are eligible. There's no match, and it's non-competitive. Those are all good things. Okay, very good. Very, very, very good. Okay, moving along, making good time, make good progress. Don't have much further to go. How's the points? Extends leasehold interest in trust or restricted land for housing purposes for 50 years. There's that 50-year reference again. Expands affordable housing opportunities. That's the whole just point of NAHASDA, is expanding Native American affordable, low-income affordable housing. When I say affordable, they're talking low income. And they do give a definition in there. There's the next bullet. Specifically addresses families who are above or below the low income. And it gives a definition in the legislation what low income, how they calculate it. what they use to calculate what percentage of median income from a certain metropolitan area is used to calculate low income based on income. So you see, if you're going through those formulas and stuff like that, and if you're asking people to provide information on their income, the wages that they made last year, the taxes that they made last year to see, or years prior, or coming up, to see if they're eligible for low income according to government standards, aren't you collecting personally identifiable information in the form of tax returns or pay stubs? So that falls right into that PII protection clause that I was talking about. All right, bottom bullet requires HUD to monitor for non-compliance and to take steps when compliance does not occur. All right, to address this, that is where the self-monitoring report comes into play, which we generate on our end, right? And it goes along with our APR, our annual performance report. That's also something we generate, right? We send that in. That is part of the bottom bullet. The HUD is requiring monitoring. So we're doing that. We're self-monitoring, and we're providing reports that have to match up with our IHP, our beginning of the year report. Otherwise, we have a problem. Then we also have the issue of audits, right? If you're receiving more than $750,000 a year in federal funds, you fall into the category of what's called a single audit. Single audit, 2 words. And it's an audit specifically for government fund recipients like IHBGs that are more than $750,000 per award year, per year. So that also falls into that bottom bullet, where HUD really doesn't have the human resource. We used to call it manpower. We don't do it anymore. We call it human resource capacity to be able to go out in the field and do a lot of program reporting. They rely on the audits. They rely on your reports a lot because they just don't have the people power to go out and do program reviews like they used to. So the onus is on us to do it and do it correctly, So that all falls into that bottom point, and it's mentioned in the legislation. What requires the tribe to use the block grant to operate and maintain current housing units? Yes. To be used for development, rehab, acquisitions, construction. And we know about those things when we spend more than $2,000 on construction and rehab, we fall into Davis-Bacon territory. And we've got a whole new set of legislation and regulations to deal with in addition to the ones what we're dealing with already. Permits the tribe to set maximum rent. And lastly, it gets into negotiated rulemaking. So you're wondering, how do they come up with these regulations from year to year and the changes I was talking about? It's called negotiated rulemaking. When they plan for a review, they invite tribal leaders and others and agency leaders together to talk about the rules. The tribes have a certain amount of time to provide feedback, usually 30, 60, or 90 days. And then they sit down and they talk through the regulations from time to time to try to figure out, if they need to make changes. They haven't done that with Davis-Bacon since 1970. Now, with NAHASDA, as you saw before, they've done it 7 times over the past 27 years. That's part of the negotiated rulemaking. The other regulations as well. What we're going to talk about next week with the HUD's 24 CFR Part 1000, Native American housing activities, that hasn't changed a whole lot. It had some updates, but there haven't been a whole lot. Then the final week, week 4, we're going to talk about the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200. That has had a couple generational changes, 3 or 4 since it rolled out in 2014. I think it's turned over. In other words, it's had updates about 4 or 5 times. So I'll address that in detail when we get to it. And just closing out here with rulemaking, just as I described, they come together, requires HUD to use negotiated rulemaking when regulations are altering regulations. It's spelled out in section 1. I missed the top bullet there. section 106 talks about it, final regulations and how they go about it, just in case you were curious. Regulations developed by committee and so on. All right. More on that. This unusual way of writing regulations is significant because it was the first step in implementing Self-Determination Act. So they used this process back in the day when they created the legislation and all the regulations, and they just followed suit since then, doing the same thing. Hello? Someone have a question? Okay, I thought you did. All right, I'm done. I'm going to just go over the review of the review. When we started, I did a refresher on part 1, as you recall, of understanding kind of the overview of grants management, and talked about the 7 areas: the resources, the award documents, self-monitoring, managing budgets, record and record keeping and reporting, along with extensions and adjustments, prior approvals, and regulatory and compliance. And then today we drilled down on the legislation, on NAHASDA, to understand how the top of the pyramid works. And because it sets the tone for everything else, it sets the tone for the regulations that are yet to be talked about. That's next week. That's part 3, understanding the HUD, Native American Housing Activity Guidelines. They're more than guidelines, they're regulations. They use guidelines, but it's really regulations. What's nice about those is they're written in a narrative style, in a question and answer format. So we're going to go through that. First half of the presentation will be on subparts A through C. Second half will be on D through H. They're all equally important. And what I'll do is I'll highlight each of the important issues in each of those 6 sections, right? And then the following week, week 4, we'll close out by going over the uniform guidance, same concept. I'll go over and highlight the important sections found in A, B, and C. Section A are the definitions. You need to know what terms are used and get comfortable with them. So that's part A. B and C of the uniform of 2 CFR Part 200 are more geared towards the federal agencies. The real bread and butter is D and E. D gets into competition and procurement. E gets into allowable costs, what you can't spend, can and can't spend, allowable, allocable, reasonable, those terms. That's all in section E. And section F gets into audits. So that's where D, E, and F are really the areas of the uniform guidance that apply to us as users of the Indian Housing Block Grant and other funding. So basically, when we get to part 4 and we're talking about the uniform guidance, we go beyond Indian Housing Block Grant. It's any organization that receives federal funding. The uniform guidance applies to churches and schools and nonprofits and tribes and any organization, any entity that receives federal funds. It's very broad in scope. And what I'll provide for you is how to navigate through it, where the area, and to interpret these regulations, especially the ones that are vaguely written. I want to highlight those so you know what they mean in my interpretation of them. So you have some kind of a foundation. And then we'll be done. We'll be done with grants management. So I'm done today. I'm going to kick it back over to Brooke in about 30 seconds. I'm going to hang here. I'll mute, but I'm going to hang, let her close, keep an eye on the chat box. And if I don't see any questions from you or concerns or issues, please do the survey. If anything, I do read them, obviously. And then please join me for the next section. That's section 3 coming up, where we get into part 3. Section 3 is part 3 on, now we're segueing into regulations. We've got, I think, a good foundation of, what grants management is. We got a good idea what the legislation is, where we're supposed to go, right? And now we're going to start breaking down, getting into the weeds a little bit and talking about specifics, right? That's what the next 2 sessions are. We couldn't go there without having a good foundation to fall back on. So join me for the next 2 sessions. I think you'll learn a lot. I think you'll enjoy it. I certainly will. Look forward to it. Thanks again, everyone. See you. Brooke, all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Vince, for all your time and effort with this. I know I certainly learned a lot. He had talked about registering for the next part, guys. I included the registration link in the chat box to register for Tribal Grants Management Part 3, and I will grab the Part 4 registration link for you in just a moment. Go ahead and type any questions you might have for Vince into the chat as I close out the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and launch today's survey for everybody. We'd really love it if you guys could take a moment to complete our survey. It only takes a minute or so, and your feedback really helps us to do more of what's working well and improve upon what maybe needs it. And we do invite you guys to be as candid, as honest, brutal as you want, because they are anonymous. So obviously Vince is wonderful and you'll have all wonderful things to say, but just feel free to be candid with these. And we look forward to the feedback. We invite you guys to join us for our next webinar. That's going to be on September 12th. And that is about going virtual, best practices and delivering online workshops. And that'll be with Lynn Wilson with IDRS. Registration is free. And feel free to access this and any of our other recorded webinars online on our website, nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Catheta Webinars tab featuring a recorded webinar section. You can click on any one of the webinars that we've done for the past 2 years. Feel free to view them and share them with your friends and colleagues. I did include a link to the Part 1 recording that's in the web links box. I'll go ahead and put that into the chat now as well. All right, and please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We even have a podcast titled Hopathanga Native American Podcast, where we discuss focused topics within tribal housing and self-determination. You can listen on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And we also do post the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. All right, folks. Once again, I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. We do hope you have a wonderful day, and we hope to connect with you guys real soon. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.